Judge Aileen Cannon. She has dismissed the Trump classified documents case because the special counsel prosecution is in violation of the Appointments Clause of the Constitution. Of course, the special counsel in the case may appeal this case.
Yeah, Judge Aileen Cannon is closing the classified documents case against Donald Trump. This was charged about a year ago in the Southern District of Florida, where prosecutors from the special counsel's office, so an office that was appointed by Merrick Garland for the particular reason to look at this in some sort of protected, independent way from the rest of the department.
It was a Monday afternoon in July when a single federal judge in Florida did something no judge in American history had ever done before. And in one stroke of a pen, she erased one of the most serious criminal cases ever brought against a former president of the United States. 40 felony counts, hundreds of classified documents allegedly stashed in bathrooms, ballrooms, and storage closets. At a private club, months of hearings, motions, and delays, all of it gone in a single 93-page order that ended not with a trial, not with a jury verdict, but with 4 words that stunned prosecutors across the country.
They brought more than 30 charges against Donald Trump for mishandling classified records after the presidency and for obstructing justice, that investigation, trying to keep them when the government wanted them back. Judge Cannon is now saying that prosecutor doesn't have the ability to bring this case in court, and thus it must be dismissed. What she's doing here, Jim, is very much in line with what Justice Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court said in a concurrence just a few days ago in the presidential immunity case. He wrote about the special counsel's office.
The clerk is directed to close this case. And just like that, the classified documents prosecution of Donald Trump was over. To understand how staggering this moment really was, you have to understand what had just happened in the days before it. 48 hours earlier, the former president had survived an assassination attempt at a rally in Pennsylvania, a bullet grazing his ear as Secret Service agents dragged him off stage, blood on his face, fist raised in defiance. The country was still reeling, still processing what could have been a national tragedy when Republicans gathered in Milwaukee for their national convention to formally crown him their nominee once again.
We are also following a major hearing in Trump's Mar-a-Lago classified documents case. Again, I know it's tough to keep all of these straight, but remember, this is the case where Donald Trump stands accused of taking highly sensitive classified documents to Mar-a-Lago after leaving the White House, after which the National Archives repeatedly asked Trump to return the documents, requests he ignored, and Trump continued to store the documents in unsecured locations throughout the Mar-a-Lago property, including these famous photos you've seen of the boxes being stored rather insecurely in bathrooms and ballrooms and more.
And it was on that exact day, the very first day of the Republican National Convention, with cameras trained on Milwaukee and a nation still shaken from the shooting, that Judge Aileen Cannon dropped her bombshell ruling from a courthouse in Fort Pierce, Florida. The timing alone felt almost impossible to believe. A former president survives being shot, walks onto a convention stage as a hero to his supporters, and 48 hours later, one of his most dangerous legal threats simply vanishes.
Today's big development, Trump's attorneys asked the judge to delay that case or even throw it out altogether. Trump's team arguing two things. One, that the Presidential Records Act was not clear enough, so Trump did not know he was breaking the law when he brought the documents to Mar-a-Lago. Two, arguing that these were his personal records he had a right to keep.
But this wasn't just about timing. This was about a legal theory that almost nobody saw coming, a theory that, if it held up, threatened to unravel not just this one case, but decades of how the Justice Department prosecutes powerful people. Judge Cannon didn't rule on whether Trump actually took the documents. She didn't rule on whether he obstructed justice. She didn't touch the actual evidence at all. Instead, she went after the foundation the entire case was built on, and she knocked it out from under the prosecution's feet. Here's what she said in plain terms. She ruled that Attorney General Merrick Garland never had the legal authority to appoint Jack Smith as special counsel in the first place.
Special counsel Jack Smith's team fighting back, saying, come on, Trump clearly knew the importance of some of the classified documents he had, pointing to a meeting Trump had at his Bedminster, New Jersey club in 2021. There's a recording of this meeting. In it, he described certain documents as classified, and he did not seem to think that they were personal. Now, that's 1 and 2. Now we turn to 3. We are also awaiting a major ruling that could come at any moment in Fulton County, Georgia. This has to do with the case against Donald Trump for trying to steal the Georgia electoral votes. Judge,
not that Smith did anything wrong, not that his investigators lied or cheated. She ruled that the position itself, the very job title of special counsel as it was used to bring this case, was unconstitutional. According to Cannon, only Congress can create a position with the kind of independent prosecutorial power Smith was given, and Congress never did that. Garland, in her view, essentially invented a powerful, unaccountable prosecutor out of thin air and handed him the authority to bring charges against a former president and current candidate for that same office. And because Smith's appointment was invalid, she reasoned, everything he did afterward, including the 40 felony charges against Trump, was invalid too.
She did, Jake. And what the Trump team is trying to do here in Florida in this federal case about classified records is the same thing they're trying to do everywhere else. They're either trying to get the case dismissed or to make things take a really long time until everyone's set to go to trial. Today, they spent 5 hours in the courtroom in arguments before Judge Cannon, where she didn't rule, but she did express some skepticism to these arguments Trump is making to have his case dismissed on the grounds that these were his personal papers that he wanted to take out of the White House, and that the law around national defense secrets is a little too vague for him to have known he shouldn't have taken them out of the White House and to Mar-a-Lago.
Legal experts watching this unfold could barely believe what they were reading. For over 50 years since the Watergate era, the Justice Department had used special counsels and independent prosecutors to investigate presidents, vice presidents, and other powerful officials without anyone seriously challenging the constitutionality of the position itself. The Supreme Court had touched on the issue before and effectively blessed similar arrangements. Now, one district judge in Florida, appointed by the very man she was ruling in favor of, had thrown all of that history out the window in a single afternoon. And it's worth remembering that this wasn't the first time Cannon's name had made headlines in connection with this case. Nearly 2 years earlier, when the FBI first searched Mar-a-Lago and recovered the classified material, Trump's legal team went to her seeking the appointment of an outside special master to review the seized documents before investigators could use them. Cannon granted that request in a ruling so broadly favorable to Trump that even some of her defenders in legal circles struggled to justify parts of it. The Justice Department appealed, and a 3-judge panel on the 11th Circuit, including 2 judges appointed by Trump himself, unanimously and rather sharply overturned her, using language that suggested she had extended Trump a legal courtesy no ordinary criminal defendant would ever receive. That earlier rebuke became part of the backstory that made this new dismissal land so differently than a typical legal ruling. This wasn't a judge with a clean slate making a bold, if controversial, call. This was a judge with a track record, a judge who had already been publicly corrected once by a conservative appellate court for how she was handling this exact case, now delivering the biggest ruling of her career once again in Trump's favor. To really grasp how unusual this was, you have to rewind even further, back to the summer of 2022, when this whole saga began. FBI agents executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago and recovered documents marked classified, some at the highest levels of sensitivity, sitting in boxes stored in a ballroom, in a bathroom, and eventually in a storage room down the hall from a swimming pool changing area. Investigators alleged that in total, more than 300 classified documents had passed through Trump's possession after he left office in January 2021, despite repeated requests from the National Archives to return them. Some of those documents allegedly touched on the military capabilities of the United States and other nations, the kind of information that, if mishandled or exposed, could put lives and national security operations at risk. Prosecutors didn't just allege that Trump kept documents he wasn't supposed to have. They alleged an active scheme to conceal them, to move boxes around before investigators could search the property, to mislead his own lawyers about what remained on site, and to obstruct a federal investigation into how it all happened. Legal analysts across the political spectrum at the time the indictment was filed described it as one of the most damning and well-documented cases Trump faced out of all 4 criminal prosecutions brought against him. And that's exactly what made Cannon's dismissal so jarring to so many people. This wasn't the weakest case collapsing under its own weight. This was widely considered the strongest one, disappearing almost overnight. And that detail cannot be overstated because it is the detail that turned this from a legal story into a firestorm. Aileen Cannon was nominated to the federal bench by Donald Trump himself, confirmed in the final weeks of his first term. So when the news broke that she was the one dismissing the entire case outright on a novel legal theory that few mainstream scholars had taken seriously, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Prosecutors were furious, legal scholars were stunned, and Trump's supporters were celebrating a victory that just days earlier they could barely have imagined coming this fast or this clean. The reaction from the legal establishment was swift and unusually blunt for a profession that typically chooses its words carefully. Former prosecutors and constitutional law professors who had spent their careers studying the separation of powers came forward one after another to argue that Cannon's reasoning contradicted established precedent stretching back to the Nixon era, when the Supreme Court itself had implicitly accepted the legitimacy of independently appointed prosecutors investigating a sitting president. Special counsels and independent prosecutors had operated under this same basic legal structure through Republican and Democratic administrations alike for half a century, investigating everyone from cabinet officials to a sitting vice president to 2 different presidents, without a single court ever ruling the position itself unconstitutional. If Cannon's reasoning held up, critics warned, it wouldn't just end this one case. It could call into question the legal basis for how the Justice Department investigates the most powerful people in the country going forward indefinitely. That is the scale of what was actually at stake in her ruling, buried underneath the immediate headlines about Trump's personal legal fate. But then something changed, and this is where the story stopped being just about one document case and started becoming about something much bigger. Because almost immediately, Jack Smith's team signaled they weren't going to just accept this and walk away. Word came out that the special counsel's office intended to appeal the dismissal, taking the fight to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, the same appellate court that had already slapped down some of Cannon's earlier rulings in this case. Legal analysts started openly speculating that this fight was far from over, and that it could eventually make its way all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. Suddenly, what looked like a clean, decisive win for Trump was looking more like round 1 of a much longer battle. Meanwhile, out on the campaign trail, the dismissal instantly became a political weapon, not just a legal footnote. Trump seized on the ruling within hours, connecting it directly to the assassination attempt he had just survived, framing both events together as proof that he was being targeted and that the system itself had turned against him. He argued publicly that if one of his cases could collapse this fast on constitutional grounds, then the other prosecutions still hanging over him deserved the exact same treatment. His rivals and critics saw it entirely differently, describing the ruling as a gift delivered at the most politically convenient moment imaginable, days before he accepted his party's nomination in a case that had once been considered the most damaging of all the charges against him. Whichever version people believed, one thing was undeniable. A case about classified documents had fully merged with a presidential campaign, and the outcome of an election was now tangled up with the outcome of a federal prosecution in a way that almost never happens in American history. And here is where the pressure started to build in a way that few people outside legal circles fully appreciated. Because Cannon's ruling wasn't just about Trump. Sitting right there alongside him as co-defendants were two other men, Walt Nauta, Trump's longtime valet and aide, and Carlos de Oliveira, a property manager at Mar-a-Lago. Both men had been indicted alongside Trump, accused of helping move and hide boxes of classified material, of lying to investigators, of playing their own roles in an alleged scheme to obstruct the government's efforts to retrieve the country's secrets. When Cannon dismissed the case, she dismissed it against all three of them. But unlike Trump, Nauta and de Oliveira didn't have the political shield of an election looming over their heads. Their fates were about to become entangled in a legal battle that would drag on long after the headlines about Trump's dismissal faded from the news cycle. What happened next shocked a lot of people who assumed this story was finished, because it wasn't. Jack Smith's team formally filed their appeal exactly as promised, arguing that Cannon had gotten the law badly wrong and that her reasoning ignored decades of settled precedent about how the Justice Department structures its investigations. For a while, it looked like this case might actually get a second life in front of appellate judges who had already shown skepticism towards some of Cannon's rulings. Legal commentators debated for months whether the 11th Circuit would reverse her, whether the case could be revived, whether Trump might once again face the possibility of standing trial over the documents found at his Florida estate. But then, in November, everything changed again. And this time, it wasn't a courtroom that decided the outcome. It was the American electorate. Donald Trump won the 2024 presidential election, defeating Kamala Harris and securing a return to the White House. And the moment that happened, the entire legal landscape shifted beneath everyone's feet. The Justice Department has a long-standing internal policy, one that goes back decades, stating that a sitting president cannot be criminally prosecuted while in office. It's the same policy that shaped how special counsel investigations were handled during Nixon's presidency and beyond. With Trump now president-elect and set to be sworn in as the sitting president of the United States, Jack Smith's office made the decision that many legal experts had already predicted was coming. They withdrew their appeal against Trump personally, effectively ending for good any chance that the classified documents case against Trump himself would ever be revived in a courtroom while he held office. You would think that would be the end of the story. A former president survives an assassination attempt, gets his case dismissed on a stunning legal technicality, wins the election, and watches the appeal against him evaporate because of a decades-old Justice Department policy. Case closed. Story over. Except it wasn't. Because remember those two other men, Nauta and de Oliveira. The appeal against them was never withdrawn. They weren't running for president. They weren't protected by any sitting president policy. Their case remained alive in the appellate court, a strange and lingering legal thread connected to a prosecution that, for Trump personally, was already dead and buried. And this is where things became even worse for anyone hoping for a clean, simple ending to this saga. Because while the legal fight over Nauta and de Oliveira quietly continued in the appellate courts, a much bigger question started looming over the entire case. Jack Smith, before his office was wound down, had been compiling a final report on his investigation, a report expected to lay out in extensive detail everything his team had found during their years-long investigation into the handling of classified documents. This is standard practice for special counsel investigations. When they wrap up, they produce a report explaining their findings, whether charges were filed or not, whether the case ended in conviction, acquittal, or dismissal, and that report was expected to become public. But it never did, because sitting right in the middle of that report's path to the public was the same judge who had dismissed the case in the first place, Aileen Cannon, and she was not about to let it see daylight easily. What followed was a grinding, months-long battle over a single question. Would Jack Smith's final report on the documents investigation ever actually be released to the American public? Cannon issued an order blocking its release, citing her original ruling that Smith had never been legally appointed in the first place. her logic extended naturally from her earlier decision. If Smith was never a lawfully appointed special counsel to begin with, she reasoned, then any official report he produced in that capacity carried the same legal defect as the indictment itself. It was, in her view, the fruit of an unconstitutional appointment, and therefore not something that should be treated as an official government document entitled to release. Outside groups did not sit quietly and accept this. Organizations dedicated to government transparency and press freedom, including American Oversight and the Knight First Amendment Institute, moved to intervene in the case, arguing that the American public had a right to know what investigators had uncovered about a former and future president's handling of national security secrets. This wasn't a minor procedural dispute buried in legal jargon. This was a fight over whether the public would ever get to see the full findings of a federal investigation into one of the most sensitive potential breaches of classified information in modern presidential history. Their argument was straightforward and, to many observers, hard to dispute on its face. Every previous special counsel investigation in recent memory, whether it targeted a president, a cabinet official, or anyone else, had ultimately produced a public report because the American people are the ones who fund these investigations. And because transparency about how the government handles allegations against its most powerful officials is treated as a cornerstone of democratic accountability. If Cannon's order stood, it would be one of the only major special counsel investigations in modern history where the findings simply disappeared into a locked drawer, never to be reviewed by the public that paid for them. But nobody expected what happened after that, or rather nobody expected just how long it would drag on, because Cannon didn't move quickly. She sat on the motions from these outside groups for an extended period, far longer than many observers thought was reasonable given how much public interest was riding on the outcome. And eventually, an appellate panel actually intervened, publicly criticizing her for what they described as undue delay in resolving the matter. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just critics on cable news or frustrated commentators online complaining that a Trump-appointed judge seemed to keep ruling in Trump's favor. This was an actual appellate panel, judges reviewing her conduct in the case, formally chiding her for dragging her feet. And even after that public rebuke, even with a court-ordered deadline hanging over her, Cannon's actions kept trending in the same direction they always had. She denied the motions from American Oversight and the Knight First Amendment Institute seeking to intervene and lift her order blocking the report. Around the same time, the appeal against Nauta and de Oliveira, the last living thread of this once massive prosecution, was finally and fully dismissed as well, closing out the criminal case completely for every defendant who had ever been charged in it. You might think that with the underlying case now entirely dead, with no defendants left facing any charges whatsoever, the rationale for keeping the report secret would collapse too. And Cannon herself remarkably acknowledged that the full dismissal undercut the reasoning behind her original order blocking its release. She admitted it on the record. And then she still kept the block in place, setting a new expiration date months into the future rather than lifting it immediately. This is where the pattern became impossible for legal observers to ignore. Time and time again, at nearly every major decision point in this case, from the initial dismissal on a novel and previously untested legal theory, to the handling of the appeal, to the blocking and reblocking of Jack Smith's final report, the rulings kept breaking in the same direction toward protecting the very man who had appointed her to the federal bench in the first place. Critics didn't need to speculate about motive to make this point. They simply had to lay out the timeline, decision after decision, and let the pattern speak for itself. And then, in February of this year, the story took its latest and perhaps most revealing turn yet. Cannon issued another order, once again granting a request from Trump and his former co-defendants, once again blocking the public release of the second volume of Jack Smith's final report, the volume specifically covering the classified documents investigation. In her written explanation, she pointed to what she described as the matter of manifest injustice that would result from disclosing it, arguing that releasing findings connected to a case that had already been fully and permanently dismissed would be fundamentally unfair to men who were never convicted of anything. On its face, that reasoning has a certain surface logic to it, but critics were quick to point out the irony sitting underneath it. This is a report investigating whether a former and now sitting president mishandled some of the nation's most closely guarded secrets. Information touching on military capabilities, both American and foreign. Information found stuffed into boxes in a ballroom, a bathroom, and a storage room at a private club in Florida. And the American public, the very people whose national security was potentially put at risk, may never get to read what investigators concluded about how that happened. This is the moment where all of these threads finally come together and where the true scale of what happened becomes impossible to ignore. What started as a single dismissal order on the first day of a political convention in the shadow of an assassination attempt has rippled outward for nearly 2 full years now. It reshaped the legal landscape around how the Justice Department can investigate powerful officials. It became a live campaign issue in a presidential election. It evaporated the moment that election was decided, thanks to a policy protecting sitting presidents from prosecution. And it has continued, quietly but persistently, to shape whether the American public will ever get to see the full findings of a federal investigation into classified information handling at the highest level of government, findings that touch on genuine questions of national security. Consider just how rare a chain of events like this actually is. Most dismissed criminal cases fade from public memory within weeks. Most legal disputes over sealed reports get resolved quietly with little fanfare long before anyone outside a courthouse notices. This case did neither. It kept resurfacing again and again at almost every major milestone along the way, from the convention to the election to the inauguration to a winter court order nearly 2 years later, still fighting over the exact same underlying question. What did investigators actually find, and will the public ever get to know it? Every single time this story seemed like it was finally over, it wasn't. Every single time a court seemed poised to close the book for good, another chapter opened instead. Think about everything that had to happen for this exact outcome to occur. A judge with a limited 12 years of legal experience before ascending to the federal bench, nominated by the very man whose case she would eventually oversee, had to rule for the first time in American history that the modern special counsel structure itself was unconstitutional. That ruling had to survive long enough and move slowly enough that it was still standing when the 2024 election arrived. That election had to go a particular way for the sitting president policy to kick in and permanently end the case against Trump personally. And even after all of that, even after the case was completely and finally closed for every single defendant, the final report explaining what investigators actually found still had to be fought over, delayed, blocked, reblocked, and kept from public view for years, right up through the present moment. What happens next is still an open question, and it's one worth watching closely. The transparency groups pushing for release of the report haven't disappeared, and the legal fight over whether the public ultimately gets to see what Jack Smith's investigators found is not necessarily finished, even with the criminal case itself dead and buried. Every deadline Cannon sets seems to create the possibility of another appeal, another intervention, another round of public pressure. And looming over all of it is the broader legal question her original ruling raised, whether the modern special counsel system, the very tool the Justice Department has relied on for half a century to investigate presidents and other powerful officials without direct political interference from the sitting administration, can survive in its current form, or whether Cannon's reasoning, if it were ever fully adopted.
Governor Jeff Landry, who called me, says, we have a crime problem in Governor Jeff Landry, who called me, says, we have a crime problem in Governor Jeff Landry, who called me, says, we have a crime problem in Governor Jeff Landry, who called me, says, we have a crime problem in Governor Jeff Landry, who